Hey, good morning. Time for our coffee break and catch up on scientific news this morning. Let me show you something interesting. This is an antique. It is a sprayer that was mostly used to spray DDT in the 1950s. And a lot of DDT was sprayed in North America, billions of tons of this material. It was very effective at controlled mosquitoes, which meant that it controlled malaria, other diseases like typhus. It seemed to be a miracle material. However, by 1962, it became clear that DDT had some untoward effects as well. For example, on birds and their ability to lay healthy eggs. And in 1962, Rachel Carson, in her classic book, Silent Spring, pointed out these problems. And by 1972, DDT had been banned. However, it is still there to haunt us. We have a recent study about the long-term effects of DDT. How long-term? Well, 3-generational. Way back in the early 1960s, a study in California began to look at pregnant women. They took blood samples from a large number of them, and then followed them and followed their children and now their grandchildren. Well, it turned out very early on that the children of the ladies who had the highest levels of DDT in their blood were more likely to become overweight and were more likely to develop breast cancer and hypertension. Well, now we have an even more intriguing study when the grandchildren of these ladies have been looked at. Now, they're still too young to see whether or not they're more prone to breast cancer, but it is clear that they're more likely to put on weight, they have a higher BMI, and they also have earlier onset of menstruation. Now, why is this of concern? Because the effects of a chemical now can be seen to linger for generations. DDT turns out to be an endocrine disruptor. These are chemicals that have hormone-like properties, and they can have a physiological effect at very, very low levels. Obviously, this was not known in the 1950s when there was the problem of insects and you needed a solution because malaria was rampant, and DDT came to the rescue. But of course, eventually we learned that it's a double-edged sword, and that is very often the case. But it does highlight the importance of looking at chemicals in the long term, even when exposure is very small. Well, we now have another study that is quite intriguing, and this is about the presence of another possible class of endocrine disruptors, the so-called polyfluorinated alkyl substances, or PFAS, as they are abbreviated, that have endocrine disrupting properties and perhaps even carcinogenic effects, and they are now showing up in our environment, even in cosmetics. The press, of course, has been all over this because any time that you link potentially problematic chemical in a consumer product, the media goes crazy over this. I like to point out that the presence of a chemical cannot be equated to the presence of risk. It all depends on exposure, the type of exposure, when someone is exposed, and obviously the amount of the exposure. In this particular case, it is true that the PFAS have been found in a large number of cosmetics, about 50% of all the ones that were tested. But the amounts are very low. It's about 1 microgram per gram of product. That is a very, very small concentration. But just because it's small doesn't mean that we can ignore it, because endocrine disrupting chemicals can be active indeed at very, very low doses. But what we don't know is whether or not the use of these cosmetics translates to having higher levels of these PFASs in the blood. There's just no data on that. So obviously, not having any data like that, we can't even determine whether or not people who have higher levels in their blood are more prone to some sort of illness. So this needs more looking into, obviously, but I don't think it's a situation where one has to go crazy worrying about the PFASs in cosmetics. First of all, these chemicals occur in much, much higher doses in a large variety of products. They're used on carpets to make them stain-free, furniture, fabric. They're used in firefighting foams. They're used to make microchips. They're used in all kinds of medical equipment where they are essential, such as various kinds of implant devices. They're used as insulation around cables. So they are very, very useful substances. They're ubiquitous. Not surprising that some of them end up in the environment. But it's also important to point out that there are close to 5,000 of these PFASs that have been developed. Obviously, not all of them are in common use, but they have very different properties. It depends on how long the main carbon chain of the molecule is and what kind of functional groups are attached to that main chain. So whereas one PFAS may be quite toxic, another one may have no biological activity at all. Nevertheless, obviously, we would rather have less of these in the environment than more. And there are some uses, of course, that can be eliminated, such as their use in cosmetics, but there are other uses that are essential, such as in medical equipment. But I think it is the public's right to know whether or not their cosmetics do contain any of these chemicals, and it should be on the label, which it is not. Now, very often it's not on the label because they are sort of just accidental contaminants in other chemicals that are used to formulate the product. But in some cases, they are added on purpose because they have remarkable film-forming abilities and they are hydrophobic, which means that they keep water away. So these are much longer-lasting cosmetics. But this is something that we have to keep an eye on. However, in the whole context of the PFASs to which we are exposed in the environment, mostly through the food, through our water, etc., their presence in cosmetics, I think, ranks very low. But of course, if they are present in cosmetics, that means that more will have to be produced, and there we have the possibility of environmental contamination. So we certainly have to keep an eye on these endocrine disrupting chemicals because, as we have seen with DDT, they can have third generation, long-lasting effects. All right, now to something a little bit more pleasant. Coffee. Well, this is a coffee break time, so it makes sense to talk about coffee. And you know that over the years, there have been all kinds of allegations about coffee causing heart disease, coffee having carcinogenic compounds. But of course, there have also been studies pointing in the other direction. And those studies now are outweighing the ones that suggest that coffee drinking is a problem. We have some really interesting studies. There's a very large study that came out of Britain where they investigated close to 500,000 people, regular coffee drinkers. And it turns out that people who drink 3 to 5 cups of coffee a day have about 15% reduced risk of dying early from all causes. Even more interesting was the tremendous reduction in suicide rates among coffee drinkers. Now, of course, a lot of this is just association. It's very hard to prove a cause and effect relationship. But we see more and more studies, things like coffee reducing risk of Parkinson's disease, etc. However, during pregnancy, one must be careful because it can lead to miscarriage. So you don't want to overdo it, certainly during pregnancy. But other than that, I think having a few cups of coffee a day cheers up your life, and it may even help you live longer. And the acrylamide or the carcinogen that is in there naturally occurring, I wouldn't worry about it because the dose is way too small. And indeed, if coffee were carcinogenic, this is something that we would know because there are enough people around the world drinking enough coffee that would have shown up epidemiologically. So there we go. We can worry about endocrine disrupting chemicals such as DDT, such as the PFAS, but coffee, let's just relax and have a sip. Have a good day. Good cup of joe.